Good day, and welcome to our worship service. My name is Joy Hembel, and I am the worship service coordinator for today. We are here with All Souls Church, where our mission is to seek truth, practice love, and celebrate life. Whether you are joining us for the first time, or you've been a member for a long time, you are welcome here. Whatever faiths you have known or not known, or whatever your heritage, you are welcome here. Whatever questions you hold, whatever truths you seek, whatever sorrow you have known, whatever joy has filled your heart, you are welcome here. Whoever you are and whomever you love, you are welcome here. We are able to have this virtual service because of the help of many. I thank our pianist Deb Reed for sharing her music with us. I thank Paul Thompson for technical support. And I thank Minister Alan Sogstad for his patience with the worship team as we continue to learn how to master new technologies. Let the worship service begin. I will now light the chalice. The chalice is lit. The reading for the chalice lighting is number 451 from our Gray Hymnal by Leslie Poe Cosbow. Flame of fire, spark of the universe that warmed our ancestral hearth, agent of life and death, symbol of truth and freedom, we strive to understand ourselves and our earthly home. Reading number 537, Our Whole System, by Maria Mitchell. Small as our whole system, compared with the infinitude of creation, brief as is our life, compared with the cycles of time, we are so tethered to all by the beautiful dependencies of law, that not only the sparrow's fall is felt to the uttermost bound, but the vibrations set in motion by the words that we utter reach through all space, and the tremor is felt through all time. So ends the reading. Now is the time when we ask for your help to do the work of our church through an offering. One half of our offerings are given to a local charity. The other half is used for our continuing operating expenses. During this time period, the board has chosen to give half of our collected offerings to the Banquet West, where many of us have volunteered and continue to volunteer. The Banquet's mission is to provide a welcoming space where people in Sioux Falls can gather, receive nourishment, and experience love in action. Please use the donate button on our church website or mail your check to the church. Please give generously. Please join me in saying the words to receive the offering. We give these gifts freely. We receive these gifts gratefully. We dedicate these gifts to the work of our congregation, serving human wholeness, caring for our planet, upholding religious freedom, welcoming the stranger, loving one another.
Today we'll begin with quotations from Native Americans, some familiar, some less familiar. The anonymous quote, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And this quote from an Oglala Lakota named John Hollow Horn, "Someday the earth will weep, she will long for her life, she will cry with tears of blood. You will then make a choice, if you will help her or let her die. And when she dies, you too will die." One of the great laws of the Iroquois nation was this one: in every deliberation, we must consider the impact on the seventh generation. I only learned that phrase fairly recently. And now, of course, there's even a cleaning supply company with the name Seventh Generation. But I've started to think about what it is to think in terms of 7 generations. And it's not that hard. If I put it in personal words, 4 of my great-grandparents were still living when I was born. And so I have a clear memory of each one of them. So that generation was born mostly in the 1870s, some of them across the ocean. My grandparents were born in the early part of the 20th century. That's the second generation. And then my parents would be the third generation. And then my brothers and I are the fourth generation. And I have daughters who are the fifth generation. And one of them has children who are the sixth generation. And I hope my granddaughter, who's part of that sixth generation, who's only 16, waits a while before bearing the seventh generation. But actually, through my wife, we are great-grandparents, because a little baby born here in Sioux Falls in February is the son of her grandson's, of her son's son. So anyway, 7 generations I have touched, you might say, in my lifetime. And so it's not quite as expansive as one might think. That's how I personalize the thought. But of course, in the Iroquois tradition, it was thinking ahead 7 generations in every political decision. What a wise principle to follow. And then this ominous quote that's also anonymous: when the last tree has been cut down, the last river has been polluted, the last fish has been caught, only then will we realize that we cannot eat money. And then finally, from our own Russell Means here in South Dakota, Mother Earth has been abused. And by the way, this one really makes me stop and think about the terrible wildfires and hurricanes, which are so much more common now. Mother Earth has been abused. The powers have been abused. This cannot go on forever. Mother Earth will retaliate. The environment will retaliate. And the abusers will be eliminated. Things come full circle back to where they started. That is revolution. We wouldn't have a climate crisis today if we had had the humility to learn from these wise people in our midst here in the United States. By awakening to this Native American understanding of the sacredness of the earth, we begin to realize that the earth is not simply something to build on and walk upon and drive upon and take for granted. It's a living entity. The earth has consciousness. From this perspective, the environmental movement really goes way back. It goes centuries back in the culture of the Native Americans. And even in our own Caucasian culture, it goes back to the early part of the 20th century, when conservation went hand in hand with political conservatism. The Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, in the early part of the 20th century, managed to set aside 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests, working with the Republican Congress to pass the Antiquities Act of 1906. My grandparents and parents, along with many of yours, I'm sure, lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s. They were champions of reduce, reuse, and recycle long before that became a catchphrase. They could make children's clothes out of curtains and hand them down from the older kids to the younger kids in the family until they were threadbare. They were very religious about not wasting electricity, not wasting water, not wasting food, and taking good care of the soil. Fast forward to the summer of 1962, when the New Yorker magazine published a 3-part series that was read by President John F. Kennedy and many, many other people, entitled Silent Spring, by a scientist and author named Rachel Carson. She identified human arrogance and financial self-interest as the root of the environmental crisis that she recognized far ahead of her time. Her major concern was the agricultural chemicals and pesticides and the havoc that they wreaked on the world of nature, especially being hard on the bird population. And DDT was one of the greatest offenders, and of course that was eventually taken off the market over the protests of the manufacturing industry. I have a personal story about that. A cousin of mine named Lois was a daddy's girl out on the farm, and at one point she was out in her father's shop and she saw this curious liquid in a can and she decided to taste it. And of course it tasted terrible and she spit it out, but I imagine she was upset and her father found out and he felt terrible when he saw that on the side of the can it said DDT. Well, she went on to grow up and get married and have children, but in her late 50s she developed some serious health problems and she had a lot of tests, and one of those tests showed the presence of DDT in her body so many years later. And what I read is that it's stored in the fat cells and it's gradually released over time. And she became very ill, but thankfully was able to go on a very rigid diet and do all kinds of fasting and cleansing. And last June she celebrated her 80th birthday. And so that's a story that has a happy ending. And one of the physician's assistants, who was very young, heard about it and she said, DDT, wasn't that outlawed back in the 1960s? So it was a learning experience for that medical student to realize how long it could stay in the human body. Well, concern for the environment grew after Rachel Carson's book was published, even though it was very controversial. But then there was the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969, in January. And Senator Gaylord Nelson, as we heard in the children's message, and Pete McCluskey, a Republican congressman, along with some 20 million Americans, 10% of the population at the time, celebrated the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. In 72, President Richard Nixon signed the Clean Air Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency was created as well. Now let's shift gears and ask a question that has been gnawing at me ever since I started doing the research on this topic. Is the phrase stewardship of creation the best way to think about this issue? Stewardship has become a catchword in the business world. You see it on posters where they're showing their company's values. And corporations use it to promote efficiency and being good stewards of the shareholders' investments. Fundraisers need to be good stewards of people's donations. Farmers talk about being good stewards of the soil. Although I met one farmer who was an exception, he confessed to me that at the time when Lake Sakakawea was going to be flooded and created from the Missouri River up in central North Dakota, he and his family owned land that was eventually going to be flooded, and knowing that, they took off heavy crops as many times as they could in the years shortly before the river was dammed up. He said, we farmed it hard and we didn't add any fertilizer because we knew it wouldn't be farmed much longer. Well, I guess the message there is that when land is passed on from one generation to another, as it is in the family farming tradition, farmers are very conscientious about leaving the land better than when they inherited it, so that their next generation can have a good chance at successful farming. But the word steward, it really means manager. And so in biblical times, the steward was the person who managed the affairs or the property or the budget of or the business of the owner. And it implies a relationship of control. It could even be traced back to the creation story in Genesis, which says, be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. But is that really the way we want to think about it today? Human beings have done a lot of damage based on that principle of subduing the earth. So I think that's something we could come back to in the circle discussion. Is stewardship the best way to think of our relationship with the earth? Or do we need to think of something more organic, as the Native Americans do, in terms of, are we partners and are we part of creation and not lords over creation? I find it encouraging to think of the critical mass that is forming today around the importance of taking seriously the issue of climate change. Insurance companies recognize the risk posed by climate-related extreme weather events. The military prepares for climate-related disasters which could lead to political instability. And so strange bedfellows or unusual alliances are formed, such as the relationship between the former mayor of New York, the billionaire Michael Bloomberg, on the one hand, and the former head of the Sierra Club, Carl Pope, on the other hand. They co-wrote this book, Climate of Hope, and I commend it to you if you want further reading on the topic. Instead of doomsday predictions about polar ice caps, they recommend talking about positive things like green jobs and improved health as reasons for seeing the importance of climate change. They suggest telling climate success stories, and they give an example of something the Chinese developed not too many years ago, of permeable concrete, which allows rainwater to flow through the concrete and replenish the ground underneath and replenish the aquifers instead of running off and flooding neighborhoods, which is what often happens in these extreme rainstorms that we have. And that permeable concrete is now being tried here in this country in Los Angeles. When Bloomberg was mayor of New York and Hurricane Sandy struck in October 2012, he responded not only by taking care of the immediate crisis, but also by helping New York to plan for the future and for future events like this. And he recognized that you couldn't simply build a wall that would withstand the sea, even though that's what some people promoted. He knew that by the time the wall got built, and after the extreme expense it would cost, it would probably be too low anyway. And he used as an example the ancient legend of King Canute. The legend is that King Canute's subjects were so devoted to him that they thought his powers were omnipotent. And King Canute didn't want to be thought that way. He knew that he didn't have omnipotent power. And so to show them that even a king had limits, King Canute had his throne brought to the edge of the sea, and then he ordered the waves not to break on his kingdom shores. And of course the tides still rolled in. And that's how King Canute showed his people that he was not omnipotent. And Michael Bloomberg was teased for bringing up that story, but he doesn't believe in trying to stop nature, but to find ways to work with the world of nature. They also recommend, instead of waiting for Congress to come together, Bloomberg and Pope show how cities and local communities can make changes. That's a major theme of their book, the grassroots efforts of local communities. And so the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, writes on the jacket of the book, "Thanks in no small part to Michael Bloomberg, mayors around the world are proving day after day that cities can tackle climate change." This is the first book that explains how. Thus wrote the mayor of Paris. A member of the German parliament asks this poignant question: who will have the courage in 25 years to tell their children, yes, we could have solved this problem, but it was too expensive? Children are also at the forefront of the grassroots movement for recognizing climate change. We've heard of Greta Thunberg, the teenager from Sweden who addressed the United Nations a couple of years ago and has become a widely known ambassador, speaking from her experience and her conviction. And more than a decade earlier, a 16-year-old girl from the Philippines spoke to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali in 2007. This girl's name was Hazel, and she was only 16 years old. And she talked about the failure of crops on her island in the Philippines because of climate change. She said that many children are not able to go to school anymore because they have to get jobs, because their parents' income of the farming is not high enough. And then the story is told of the children at a school in El Salvador who recognized that a quarry on a riverbank was causing the risk of landslides and floods in their community. And so they got the local government to stop the mining along that section of the river and even change the practice over the border in Honduras. And so children who will live much longer than the rest of us are getting involved and recognizing the importance of saving the earth. I'll close with a few more quotes from Native Americans, these more hopeful ones. An anonymous quote that says, "Regard heaven as your father, earth as your mother, and all lives as your brothers and sisters." And then this Apache blessing, "May the sun bring you energy by day. May the moon softly restore you by night. May the rain wash away your worries. May the wind blow new strength into your being. And may you walk gently through the world and know its beauty all the days of your life." And finally, these words of Crazy Horse. "I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of humankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. May it be so."
I'm extinguishing the chalice. The chalice is extinguished, but the light goes with us out into the world.